COVID battered college enrollment during the pandemic, wreaking havoc on funding as students delayed enrollment or opted to go directly into the workforce. Now, those institutions are also facing rising costs, with the higher education price index outpacing the consumer inflation by 2%. We're here to discuss the implications for colleges as well as the public school system is Marguerite Roza, director of Georgetown University's Edunomics Lab. Good to have you on the show, Marguerite. So we've been hearing a lot about this fiscal cliff, some of these funds that will be ending in 2024. What do people need to know about it and what that actually is going to do in terms of education?
Well, so the federal government put a lot of relief funds into public schools starting in 2020 and again in another wave in 2021. And school districts have been making good use of those funds. They're spending altogether about $5 billion a month right now as part of the federal relief funds on all sorts of things, including pay raises for teachers. But that money ends abruptly September 2024. And it means that we have one more school year after this one where schools are propped up by these federal relief funds. And then we call it a fiscal cliff when schools have to adjust to a new and lower spending amount. And so if those funds have gone into pay raises or hiring new people or new programs or services, then schools will be struggling to make those cuts.
So then put that in context of what we saw in terms of how education fared with this latest CPI data and what that might perhaps spell ahead.
Right. So the CPI data. So as you know, we've had a bunch of months of inflation. In fact, many school districts saw that inflation and gave out larger than typical raises to teachers and bus drivers and food service workers and custodians and all the employees in the system. So really, in the end, labor is the biggest piece of public education. 80 to 90% of public education is labor. So when inflation goes up, the system wants to give raises to its employees. Well, those raises become the new permanent baseline. And when the funding disappears, there's still a commitment to maintain these raises. So that's what we're thinking is the largest effect. Inflation also affects what parents pay for when they, back to school costs. They buy supplies and notebooks and clothes and things like that. There's a transportation element. When you see oil, gas prices go up, then that can affect school districts. But really, the largest piece of this is the labor bill, because it's 80 to 90% of what this $700 billion industry is using its money for. So it's those raises that I think are the piece of this that make public education a bit precarious, not this next school year, but the year after.
And as we speak about public education, we did see during the pandemic, obviously, a lot of school closures there. Private schools that perhaps didn't have as many restrictions saw an influx of some of those students. Tell us about what's happening in the public education space and what we might see going forward.
So it's really all comes together in what we're calling the fiscal cliff. It's a bit of a perfect storm for public education finances. So you have this federal relief money ending in a year. You've had all of this pressure for larger raises because of inflation, and add into it that school districts have lost some enrollment. And it's not just switches to private schools. It's some parents are homeschooling. Some have just migrated to different parts of the country. Some students have dropped out of high school early, and we have lower birth rates in this country right now. So we just have a decline in our student age population. But all of those enrollment declines, they add up to about, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1% to 3% of an adjustment. And for a school district, believe it or not, that is a large reduction. And so for a school district that it typically gets its money based on the number of kids it has, if it has many fewer kids in the next year or two, it means that school districts will have to start to right size their operations. And many of them, that may mean closing a school. That is about the hardest thing school districts can do, which is close a school, engage with their community, move students around. So we're likely expecting a lot of a pain dialogue discussion when it comes to how to right size districts and whether and which schools to close.
And what about when it comes to college enrollment? College being so expensive, a lot of people chose to go into the workforce. Right now, you have very low unemployment rate. It's much easier for people to get a job than before. What does that mean in terms of college enrollment going forward?
Well, the enrollment declines across the board for student populations mean that K through 12 has fewer students. It also means that those enrollment declines ultimately mean fewer students in higher education. You're right that with more opportunities in the workforce right now, and whenever we see more opportunities in the workforce, then we see fewer students in college. There are more opportunities to get loans and funding from colleges. What we expect is that this will hurt the colleges kind of on the margin, those smaller colleges that can't afford to lose 5% of their students, not necessarily these large public universities or the most selective private universities, but the smaller regional public colleges and some of the smaller liberal arts private schools, private colleges that really they can't sort of right size their finances with the loss of some students. So I think we're going to see a fewer number of colleges going forward.
And that certainly would be unfortunate. A big thank you there. Georgetown's Edunomics Lab Director, Marguerite Roza. Thank you for joining me.